Hello, everyone. Welcome to School After Hours podcast, where staff, administrators, and families keep their finger on the pulse of the wonderful world of OST programming, aka our school time programming. I am your host, Jay Lee, and today we have the wonderful Christopher Lee on the show. Yes, Christopher Lee, you guessed it, he is my husband. He has been in the after-school and nonprofit world for a number of years. Chris has done everything from volunteer management to teaching classes to planning and executing events to creating innovative program systems, as well as developing and delivering trainings for various organizations and so much more. But today, in our first ever Afterschool Experiences episode, we're going to have him share some of his experiences as a volunteer manager. Now, our Afterschool Experiences episodes will be shows that are more informal and focus on the shared experiences among professionals in the afterschool programming and youth development field. Hopefully, this will spread some knowledge about some of the things we experience behind the scenes and spread a little bit of wisdom along the way. Don't worry though, we'll still have our community corner and our professionals lounge as usual. Speaking of Community Corner, let's jump into that segment right now. Community Corner is a segment of the show that allows guests or myself to share tips, advice, or information about the OST fields with families, youth, and community members. For this episode's Community Corner, I asked Chris, what are some things you would like parents to consider about after-school programming? Here was his response.
Well, over the years, I've been a volunteer and a staff member of after-school programs. And I think on both counts, it's important for parents to think of us as partners in terms of the ups and the downs. And in this case, behavior is important. There's a couple of aspects here. As a volunteer after school, I'm doing this after work. And so I think about the fact that if I'm doing that, then I'm specifically doing that because I care about your child. If I'm a staff member, if you think that a teacher doesn't get paid much, I can tell you firsthand, after-school staff does not get paid according to the amount of work that we've done. So we are purely doing it for love. And so if we have an issue and you're contacted, trust first, trust me, we're partners. Until you learn otherwise, always assume that that staff member and that volunteer wants the best for your child. I can tell you, I get no satisfaction out of whether or not the child is punished at home or doesn't get their allowance. All I'm interested in as a staff member is this child going to learn and grow and be a good citizen and learn these lessons? And when we have behavior issues, understand that sure, I want the behavior to be good during the after-school program, but I have an interest in their present and their future. And so please, I think that's something that would really help after-school staff. I mean, it helps teachers too. You know, back in the day, if a teacher contacted the parent and said, my child is acting up, called you in for a meeting, parents said, oh, they're going to get it when we get home. And you knew we were working together. Now it can be very different when you have to report a behavior problem because they want to maybe say that, oh, well, you don't know how to work with my child. But understand, we know there are a lot of circumstances. Maybe they had a rough day. Maybe this is not a normal thing for them. Maybe if the child is taking medication, maybe it's worn out by the time they get to us. We know that. So if we can work in partnership, whether we're volunteers or staff, and say, okay, well, let's try this and see if that helps. And often that makes it easier for the child too, because they know that they can then see that everyone is there for them and everybody's working together. So they feel more of a wraparound community experience. The other piece of advice I would give parents is get involved in those after-school programs. I know it's difficult. Maybe you're a single parent. Maybe you're working late. Maybe this, that, and the other. There's all kinds of reasons that can make it difficult. Maybe you work nights. But every now and then, it's great to stop by. It's comforting. I can tell you, as from the volunteer perspective, for me, I knew that I loved to meet the parents of the kids that I was working with because, again, talking about that kind of partnership piece, it's not just about behavior management and things like that. It's about understanding that child, understanding their needs. It's so important, and especially when it's a new relationship, it's not that, as a volunteer, you necessarily need to feel like part of the family, but we're all there for the same reason. It's just I can't even really articulate, I guess, how comforting it is as a volunteer. As a staff member, it's great because you got those extra eyes. That's always fun. You're already probably overworked if you're an after school program person. And it's always great because parents are gonna keep things in order when they're there, and it's just great because the kids keep things more in order when the more adults you have around too. But also, it's wonderful for other children. I can't tell you how many times when parents would stop by, the relationships, whether those children knew each other outside of the program, maybe during the school day or in the neighborhood, it's amazing the relationships that can be built from one student's parent to another student that they may or may not know. They love to meet because it's like that child may get sick, your child may get sick of seeing you every day and being at home, but other children really think other parents are cool. You may not know that, but it's so true. But then also gives you the opportunity, which we'll get into later in the show, to really understand what the program is about on a first-hand basis, and then maybe come up with ideas and want to get involved in what the child and the other children are doing. That is just an invaluable tool. It's an invaluable experience for staff and volunteers. And again, we'll get more into that later, but my main thing is get involved. And there's so many reasons to do that. And it'll give you more comfort as well to meet and create relationships with the people that your child is working with.
Thank you for sharing that information, Chris. Now, let's jump into the show. All right, sir. So tell us a little bit about yourself and why you wanted to be a volunteer with youth programs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Lee. I have been in the youth development field for 10 plus years. I started in the summer of 2010 as a volunteer for Higher Achievement Richmond. I ended up working there and volunteering at the same time for 6 years. And then I worked as the Community Engagement Coordinator at VPM, our local PBS and NPR affiliate. And my most recent role was as the Relationship Manager at the great Partnership for the Future here in Richmond. But my favorite role is the husband of your host, Jay Lee. We are married. We met on the journey that I mentioned, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. I don't know. And how I got into it, at the time, my grandmother was working at the Richmond Police Department when Higher Achievement Richmond was first starting. And I think they were just kind of throwing their net wide, and they had sent emails out to all the city employees. And my grandmother forwarded the email to me, and I'd never worked with children, had no background whatsoever in education, never volunteered for anything that I can remember. And yet something called me to it. I was at a very interesting time of life, and I often tell people, and maybe we'll get into this later, that Higher Achievement and the kids that I work with, I think truly saved my life and certainly changed my life. And so I guess it was meant to be that I did it. So that's how I got involved, and I've basically been in it ever since. So it was definitely a life-changing, email. So that can happen. An email can change your life. So that's that. And as far as why I wanted to be a volunteer, I have no answer as far as why I first got into it, because it's like I said, that email came at the right time. There wasn't anything fancy or anything special about the email. It just was the right time for me. And I remember I was really nervous about it because I had none of the background, never worked with children. And I remember that summer, it was their first summer academy. And the assistant center director recommended that I go ahead and come out and kind of just visit and see the kids and see the program. The summer program is very different because there's no volunteering in the summer. So it was really mainly to kind of meet the staff and to meet the kids and just get a feel for it. And I did. And I went out and ended up going on field trips and stuff and everything. I remember carrying bags and whatnot. It became a whole...
They reeled you in. They put you to work.
Yeah. I mean, because at the time, the program had been around. It started in DC 30 some years at that point prior. Now it's over 40 years ago. But in Richmond, it was brand new. Everything was new. The staff was new. The kids were new. The volunteers were new. And it was a program that was unlike any other programs that existed at the time. And so it was almost like, I call it a grassroots thing. And so if you were there, volunteer or whatever, you were pitching in and doing whatever. And, you felt like part of the family. And so that experience of meeting those kids and being on the field trip I didn't know anyone at all. and none of the kids, I was brand new to the kids. And so, but it was so welcoming, so warm, because it was like a small family sort of at the time. I don't remember how many children were in the program at the time. We called them scholars in that
Mm-hmm.
program. I don't remember how many scholars were in the program, but it was probably no more than 40, 50, maybe at the most,
Right.
which may sound like a lot to some folks, but it's not compared to what would come later.
Yeah. So
But
what it grew to X
yeah,
and Y Z years later.
yeah, it grew quite a bit. And so it felt like a small little family. And then after that, I was kind of said, you know what, I do want to be involved. And I didn't know what it would look like, but I said, man, I feel something here. And so I guess if I had to say, why did I want to volunteer? I mean, the only thing I could say beyond I felt like I was called to do it, it was from that visiting and seeing the program, which ties into what I was talking about in Community Corner, even with parents. Come see these programs and see what it's all about. I didn't mention this. We had a lot of parents that came to visit. They volunteered. They ended up doing the
Mm-hmm.
mentoring piece. So yeah, that's how I got involved. Just being around those kids. They were amazing. They were truly amazing.
Whoop, whoop. Awesome. The children reeled you in. The program probably kind of sold it to you like, hey, come on. You know you want to.
Yeah, it was interesting because I think they were still trying to figure out what the program was. I mean, honestly, it's like something we'll talk about later too, culture. They were still trying to figure out what the culture was. And so they were welcoming, I think, of anyone doing anything to come in and help out. So I really felt like part of the family. They definitely reeled me in just by them trying to figure it out too. I was like, maybe I can, figure it out with you. It felt like I was on the ground floor. So it was great.
Did you have any concerns? And I know you mentioned it earlier, some of your concerns about volunteering as a person that didn't have experience with children, but also you were kind of new to the after school programming world at the same time. Walk us through some of your concerns as you're, being onboarded and going through that process of being a volunteer.
It's interesting because when we were kind of talking about what we were going to talk about on the show, I mean, I've been in it and done this for so long. There's so many things I could say. But so I want to kind of hit some things that were relevant to me personally, but then things that I think there's not a lot of spaces that do what this show does in terms of kind of just speaking the truth and kind of getting some stuff out there about concerns and everything else. So I'll kind of speak to that. One of the first ones I'll tell you is, like I said, I'd never worked with youth. And so I had no training in terms of not just background in education, but behavior management and conflict resolution and all of that. And so my concern was, okay, first of all, how does the program work on a daily basis? What is it going to look like? But then how do I handle certain things? And what is it? At what point do I kick that to staff? And do I talk to parents? Like all these things that were barriers to entry, I guess you could say. That was a big one for me because, what I can tell you is even though we did go through, training, so to speak, it was more like the bulk of it at that time was, let's tell you about the program and our outcomes over the years in general. In Richmond, we didn't have outcomes yet because it just started, but what is the purpose of it? And then we talked about AYD, which I think has been mentioned on this show, advancing youth development, or at least it's been talked about in terms of, it's called different things, but
Right.
it was sort of like, I think it was like Maslow's hierarchy of needs was talked about and how that applied
Yep.
and all these different things. And we did do some scenarios. I think we did scenarios at that time. I mean, it's been a while. I know I definitely instituted them later when I was staff and training people, but there's still those questions when you don't have that on the ground experience. So I was really concerned about that. The other thing sort of related to that, I guess a more humorous note is I'm not cool. I
What you mean, sir? What's
as
he
long
trying to say?
Well, you might think I'm cool, but and that counts. But going through, and I think, actually kind of wrap around, I was an outsider in school. I was very much into books and video games and like my own world. And I'm not like that I necessarily wanted to be, but in terms of at that time, it's very different now. At like right now, I'd be very cool if I was in school because I'm into all the stuff that kids are into now. But at that time, you kind of had to be, if you were a boy, it had to be sports and it had to be this, and this, and video games were not cool, none of that stuff. And so I didn't know what I could offer. as a volunteer. And actually, because I had that concern, it was something that I applied later, because I was very worried, to the point that I'd never considered not doing it. But
Mhm.
there was pause, and like, I was worried, because you're sitting in front of these kids. And so the kids Higher Achievement served, they were from underserved communities, and I think Title I schools and that kind of thing. And you don't
Mhm.
know what to expect. You don't know in terms of what are they into, because I hadn't. These are middle schoolers. I didn't mention
Right.
that these are middle school age kids.
I haven't been a middle schooler in a minute.
Yeah. So that it was a lot of uncertainty, a lot. And at that time, the last thing I'll say about that is too, I think there's a lot more information, data, and studies out there now about, like, if you're trying to get into either as as a staff member or as a volunteer, you can kind of have your finger on the pulse now more before you step into that world than there was at that time. Again, too, yeah, I remind you, it was a grassroots kind of thing, and so they were trying to figure out, what do we need to tell people? How do we need to do this? And so yeah, but and the last one that is super important. I was a man going into working with children, and
Mm.
the there's that's such a big discussion. But I can tell you, as a volunteer, it was almost a barrier to entry in a way, because there's so many, I guess, sort of, I don't want to say stereotypes, but there's a stigma sometimes, or a thought.
Mhm.
And even to this day, the majority of people working in OST programming, they're female. And I can tell you, as a staff member, when I had to recruit and train volunteers later, and to this day still, it's hard to get men involved, but then also even harder to get men of color
Ooh.
around these kids. It's so important, because so my place that the place that I worked the majority of my time was Bouchard Middle School. And it was, over the years, it became more and more Hispanic population, got higher and higher. And so when you think about volunteering, and I'll get back to being a man in OST really quickly, but I just want to put, because this is something that was always very dear to me in terms of something to tackle. You want
Mhm.
to have, you talk about representation. You want to have Hispanic volunteers to have worked with Hispanic kids. You want to have men to work with the boys and women to work with the girls. And it doesn't mean that those things have to be man to boy. And it just means some children respond better. You want to see and be around people that are like you, not exclusively necessarily, but it helps.
Mhm.
And in terms of language, in terms of shared experiences, and all that stuff. So to go back to being a man in OST, ironically, what would end up happening is the majority of the groups that I mentored were girls, which was funny enough. But I remember just kind of being like, do I fit in the space? Which is odd, because everybody needs to be in that space working with children. But the last thing I'll tell you, and I think this will tie in later too, later when I would train, so I never expressed that to
Mhm.
anyone. And I never heard anyone express it to me until much later, when I was training folks. I remember many years later, when I was training at Higher Achievement, and I became the volunteer coordinator. And once the school year started, we'd have our big trainings, 30, 40 people at a time. But later on, we would still take volunteers. We needed them that bad to come and mentor with our kids. It was an academic program. I don't think we mentioned that yet either. It was academics. You would come and mentor
Mhm.
English and then like seminar, I think we called it, where it could be
Mhm.
about different public speaking and different things like that.
Right.
And
Which later becomes like science,
yeah,
STEM, and then social emotional learning, as
yeah.
time went on.
Yeah, it changed over the years, but at that time it was certain specific things. And so we just needed people to fill slots, because we were 3 days a week and we had a lot of kids, and they would be in groups of, theoretically 3 to 5. And so some nights I would end up training just one person, and it would be 6, 7 o'clock at night when they got off work. So I'd be in the office for a long time. And there was one night, it was just me and this other gentleman, and he was a first time volunteer, first time working with the kids, just like I was years prior. And he said to me, he said, I have a question. He was hesitant, to put this out there. He was like, well, I'm a little worried, I'm a man and I'm working with these young kids, and what are some things in place? I don't, I want to make sure that everything always looks above board. I'm
Mhm.
nervous about working with kids. I don't want to be alone with them or anything, just because, especially during that time, I was remembering there was a lot of stories going on around children and adults and things, and nobody likes that. It makes a lot of us angry to hear those things. And he was real hesitant. I think not that he, again, just like me, not that he didn't want to do it, but he wanted some assurances of safety
Mhm.
for everyone,
Right. Right.
and it was amazing to hear that, because I certainly never put it out there, but he did. And that conversation with him and my assurances to him, because we did have things in place, which was great. And that influenced
What
me.
were those things?
Okay.
'Cause
Well,
you say, and people gonna ask, like,
right.
so what were those things? Give us some examples. What were those things?
Well, every program is different, but at that time, higher achievement, we had the benefit of, we worked out of, schools. And so we had some big spaces we worked in. You were very likely never to be alone. First of all, at least one other group would always be in the space you were in. And certain spaces, it would be maybe 3 or 4 other groups working. And like, we had a very big cafeteria. So you would have 5 or 6 maybe groups in there. There was always going to be other adults around. Staff always did rotations. So we were lucky enough at the time to have a pretty decent amount of staff at night. And so sometimes they would just be stationed in the room, but often, depending on where sometimes we had classrooms and things. And so staff would, throughout the whole night, they just walking around, making sure everything's cool. We never allowed doors to be closed. And that was important. And the thing is too, it was comforting, I think, to staff. It was comforting to parents. It was comforting to volunteers. It was comforting to kids to know that they don't have to be alone with an adult, that even if you knew them, you want to, I call it being above reproach, in terms of, I know that anytime that I might be alone with a group, I get a little nervous, because here's the thing, I'll be honest, I'll put it out there. In today's world, if there's even an allegation, it can be completely 100% false. Wherever it comes from, you might be done in that field, whether you're a volunteer or a staff member, even if it's 100% false, because it becomes this stigma. And the thing is, I really became, especially when I was a staff member, I was all about, let's make sure that there's no chance that anyone can say or do anything, because I don't want anybody to go through that. So to go all the way back to the original question, that was a concern for me. I'm a man in OST. What is that going to be like? How am I protected? So
right.
Those were my concerns as a volunteer going in.
Right, but it brings up a good point of staff doing rotations, some of the things that you all had in place to kind of reassure volunteers, but also give opportunities for collaboration. Because one of the things that Higher Achievement did do, they did mentor lounges at the end of the night, where mentors were able to come together, kind of review their day and review curriculum to say, what is working, what's not working, and kind of gave you a chance to introduce yourselves to different mentors from different groups, from different grade levels. Because you had, at the time, 5th graders were getting mentors too. And later on, like 5th graders would kind of pause and we'd come back to that. So everyone from 5th grade to 8th grade was getting mentors.
Well, in theory, that was a whole other challenge.
Right. In theory, quote unquote.
Yeah. It's still a challenge.
Within your mentoring group, and boy, it was a hustle. Oh my gosh, it was a hustle. Mentor lounges. Gave mentors a chance to connect. It gave mentors a chance to kind of go over curriculum, but also kind of collaborate at the same time, and group together and build relationships, not just with the other mentors, but also with the other students as well. Because if one mentor wasn't there specifically for the night, they would then partner with the mentor group that may have been in occupying that space or occupying that room or cafeteria. And it kind of evened the load, let me say, and also still giving the staff kind of chances to walk around the building, make sure everybody else was okay.
Yeah,
but that was very important.
Yeah, if we were lucky enough to have enough staff, sometimes staff would kind of lead a group in a seminar or something like that too. So that became a juggling act as well. But even then, staff would rotate into those and all these things. And so.
But also talk about one of those things that you said, like behavior management. Like, what are some of the things that you're doing with your group that's working that I could potentially add to my group when it comes to increasing performance or reading, writing, all those things that we were doing to help with performance, let me say.
In terms of behavior management or sort of like growing group culture?
Well, let's say both, because some of the times they may have not been interested in the curriculum. There's some things that you have to look out for as far as behavior, as far as the students becoming a distraction, but also giving them an incentive in the sense of saying, okay, if we can do this, I can give you time to do this. And using it as leverage, but also even little small incentives, like if we complete so many amount of lessons for this month, whichever case may be, we could then have like a treasure box or a treat, and you all can go ahead and do or get that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of techniques, fortunately. And I say fortunately because every group is different. I definitely learned that. But yeah, the first thing that I always stressed, and this goes for any program, anything where someone's working with children, whether you're a volunteer or not, build relationships. I think because seeking one of my favorite videos from a TED Talk, and I should have looked up her name, Rita something. She talked about seeking first to understand before being understood. And I think really good behavior management starts with a rapport, if you can have that.
Hmm.
And there's so many techniques. That's a whole show almost. But in terms of like techniques, you mentioned, I know one really cool mentor that we had. She had a jar, and I think she had 3 to 4 kids or scholars. I want to make sure because it's high achievement time.
Right, right.
And
The language is still relevant. The
yes,
language is
yes.
still relevant.
3 to 4 scholars, and I think it was something like every time that they had the kids contributed to, the scholars would contribute to a part in the lesson, a marble or something like that would go in, and all like, so there was a lot of ways that marbles could go in. And so that was one positive reinforcement. And at the end, I think at the end of the semester, they could choose from like a menu of options of what their big thing was. So maybe like a pizza party, or maybe it was a field trip that they could go on, or things like that. And that was always great. I mean, I call it, you can call it bribery if you want, but I call it positive reinforcement. I think that's a great one. When you talk about students kind of not being into a lesson or being bored, there was these techniques, and you're very familiar with these, where like a turn and talk, I think we had it. So
Yeah. Hmm.
you got to, okay, so in this program, you got to remember, so these kids were in school during the day. So they get up and be at school. They have to get up and get on the bus early. They're in school all day long. And our program at the time started at something like, if I remember, it was like 2:30, 3 o'clock, something like that.
Yeah.
And
As soon as school ended.
yeah, and at that time, the program went. I think it's changed now, and you would know better than me. The program
Yeah.
has changed now. Like, oh, so at the time it went until like 7 almost, or 6:30, and I don't know if
No, it
that's
was not
changed.
6:30. I remember that. It was
Yeah,
so not 6:30. It
yeah.
was about 7:30, 8. It was about
Was it?
7:30, 8 o'clock.
Was it that late? Okay, it's been a while. Yeah, I
Yes.
remember it was late. I remember that. Yeah. So
Because that was one of
imagine,
the main complaints the parents had.
yeah, yeah, and imagine they've been in school all day from, I don't. This is bad because I don't know what time school starts right now. It's like 8 o'clock, 8. I don't know, but basically they're working. These kids are working a 12-hour day if you think about it. So they've been in school having a teacher basically generally talk at them in all their classes, right? So using methods to change that. You don't want any of your programs to seem anything like school, whether it's higher achievement, anything else that you do. You don't want it to be the same, because then it's like to them, oh my God, I'm in class all day. And this is only
Hmm.
3 days a week at the time. And a lot of these programs now, it's 5 days a week, 4 or 5 days. And so you want to break those things up, giving kids the opportunity to speak to each other and share ideas and do things together, activities, even getting up, doing physical things. There was techniques, and I think you saw this when you were working at Henderson Middle, where they would go to the gym, and so
Yep.
you would say, okay, if you answer such and such question, you can shoot baskets. Like, okay, you answer this
Yep.
question, you can shoot. Get them up, get them around, moving. All that stuff is really important, and I think that helps with the challenges in terms of, for staff. It helps with challenges in terms of the volunteers that work with them and all of that. Does that answer the question? I got into talking about it and I forgot the specific question, but there's so many great techniques. And the great thing too, you can even, if you're a volunteer, if the
Hmm.
program that you're working with doesn't offer or doesn't give you everything you want right away, there's so many great resources on the internet now that did not exist when I was doing it. There's great icebreakers. So those are the things that you do when you first meet your group every day, or whenever you work with them every week. And I'll tell you one thing I did. I didn't go into
Hmm.
this when I was volunteering. I did literature was my thing, English, and I did 2 things. I would bring at the time, this tells you how long ago this was. I had an iPod and a speaker I could hook it up to, and I would play a song every time we would first meet. And what I did, I had a sheet that I had, because my goal was to make the connection between music and literature and all that, like it's all the same, whether it's
Right.
poetry, whatever. And so I would play a song, and I would have a sheet with questions to say, What do you think that the artist was trying to get across? What did it make you feel? What did you think about? All of that stuff. And that was a great thing to just kind of like, it tied into what we were kind of going to be doing, but it was also a shared experience. It
Mm-hmm.
was music. And so I would, of course, I would play hip hop and stuff because, that was the thing. But then also I'd play classical, I'd play grunge music. I love everything. So I wanted to expose them to everything I could. And that was also a way for me to inject my own personality into the
Mm-hmm.
proceedings. And so that's a great technique. That's also relationship building because you're sharing part of yourself and you're talking about, oh, well, oh, you got that from it. That's cool. I got, this is what it meant to me, et cetera, et cetera. So it's behavior management in that it cuts it off, before it can start in a way, it gets them involved. And so there may not be a chance for bad behavior. And also
Right.
talking about positive reinforcement. I'm not ashamed to say every now and then I bring some candy and stuff. I bring some food. Hey, look,
Right. These children teeth.
yeah.
Give
Well,
them a
hey,
color pencil.
look, hey, I did everything. So it was, but that's the thing. The last thing I'll say on all of that is that bring yourself to the proceedings, but meet in the middle, learn each other, treat them. You don't have to treat them as equals, but talk to them like they're, I don't know if I want to say adults, but they're human beings too.
Mm-hmm.
Find out what their interests are and bring those to the table. Be willing to learn from them. Those are things I think, going back to like almost what my concerns were. How am I going to make a connection? And making that, it's easy to make that connection if you learn what they like and then learn about what they like, and have
Mm-hmm.
conversations and get into it. And that'll make them want to come and learn more about you. And there was a mentor a few years after I started. The guy had to be in his 70s. And here he is working at a predominantly, I think all the students, this was at Henderson, and all the kids are African American. He's a 70-year-old Caucasian gentleman. Think of the guy from Up. If you've seen the movie Up, he looked like that dude. Straight up, he looked like that guy. And I remember thinking to myself, oh man, okay, he's gonna come in here and just do this. Okay. And you would think if you never work with kids, you'd be like, how are they gonna connect? What are they gonna, but man, they loved that dude. They loved him because he had stories. Kids are curious. It doesn't matter where they're from or who they are. They want to know stuff. They want to hear things and life experiences. And yeah, maybe he wasn't tuned into hip hop and everything, but like he was a cool dude in terms of just having a life. So sharing your life experiences with them. Talk about your children. If you got children, talk about your children, your grandchildren, whatever. They're going to ask you questions. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a connection. So that's what I learned. Connect with them, and that helps with behavior because then they see you as not just some adult, but it's like, oh, that's Mr. Christopher.
Right.
It's
You
not
are a
just,
person. You
yeah,
are made a person in their eyes at that point. Like, oh,
yeah. So that's important stuff. I know we got off track a little bit, but I always think, this is a shared experiences episode. It's a little different in a way from your other ones. So, I just want to share stuff as it comes to me that's kind of relevant. So,
that's fine. Go ahead. Share away. Share away.
well, you know how I
Uh,
am. So I gotta like curtail myself a little bit. So I'm cutting it off right there.
All right, so we're going to go into your volunteer manager experience. So,
Hmm.
because you've had a chance to be a volunteer, but also you were a volunteer manager
Hmm.
for the same organization, how did that influence your training for volunteers, if it
Hmm.
did?
Oh, 100%. Going back to my concerns and stuff as a volunteer, I think I wish we had time to get into the whole journey as far as how it came about that I became volunteer coordinator because I actually,
Because that's important. Like
well,
that's the
okay.
connection.
All right. Well, I'll make it real short. So as a
Hmm.
volunteer, I had one group on Tuesday nights. That's how I started. And I loved it so much. I think it was like a month later, I said, give me another group. And so I had two groups. It was Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so it went along and I just became so involved in the program. And then they needed study hall. I think they called them coaches, like achievement coaches,
Hmm.
different things. So they
Achievement
actually,
coaches.
was it?
Yeah, achievement coaches.
Yeah, and stuff like that. So they actually hired me to do that part time as well. So the next year they needed the staff, they needed more staff, and so they wanted me to be a site aide, and I said sure. So I did that, and that went well. And then there's a program called AmeriCorps. I think a lot of you all may be familiar with, and so there's AmeriCorps ACEs and there's AmeriCorps Vista. So ACEs are local. And they kind of, I forget the exact designation, but they work part time. And I wanted to work during the summer. I was like, I miss the kids during the summer because there's no volunteer opportunities then. At least at
Hmm.
that time there weren't. And so I signed up to be an AmeriCorps ACE just so I could work with them during the summer. That went well. And during that summer, AmeriCorps Vista is a national program where they place people who sign up with nonprofits. It could be anywhere in the country. And these usually are programs that are just starting out. Maybe they don't have a lot of staff or resources. And so AmeriCorps Vistas can be assigned to help them grow their program and create legacy stuff and all that kind of thing. So they came to me and said, hey, we're signing up to get some AmeriCorps Vistas. And one of the roles for the Vista that they wanted was a volunteer coordinator. And I said, yep. And so
you think twice about it?
yeah,
You just like,
I was like,
you
yeah.
didn't say, let me think about it. He was like, yeah, no, sign me up. Sure.
Yeah, hey, the program meant a lot to me. The kids meant a lot, and I would do anything I could to be involved and to stay there. And so I did. And I think too, they knew that I had been volunteering for 2.5 years or whatever it was at that point. And so they knew I had the experience. There we go. And so all of the basically being staff in various capacities at that point while still volunteering and being around these kids, I kind of had a feel for what the concerns were. I knew what mine were. I knew what reassurances I needed that maybe I wasn't getting, but not by fault of anyone, just by the program just being new and trying to figure out. And of course, we had some help from our national headquarters in those terms, but every program is different and every site in that program is different. And so it was kind of, I thought, okay, what are some general things that I can help with? And I definitely transferred those things, again, like the reassurances of like, hey, you're never going to be alone with the kids, and share your life with them, share your experiences. Don't worry about, like we had accountants and they thought, I don't have much of a personality. I don't know. I was like, don't worry about that. Honestly, don't. You'll be surprised at what kids gravitate towards too. They like everybody. It's like, it's so true. They want to learn from everybody and everything. So never be afraid of that. And so when it came to training, I inserted all those things into it, because at the point that I usually got you were already signed up to do it. But I didn't want you to feel, reticent to continue the process. And so, yeah, I inserted a lot of my experiences into it in terms of behavior management. I would relate stories that I went through to let them know, like, hey, this can be real and don't worry about it. I had seen a lot by then. Also, I think it's important to address the level of support that you're going to get, or that we were going to provide as staff, because the fact is, no matter how good you are as a volunteer in anything you do, any job you do, anything you do in life, period, but especially working with children, you're going to face some challenges. And I think it was very important in terms of talking about reassurance that, look, just because something happens doesn't make you a bad mentor or volunteer, because you're talking about variables and factors here. You're talking about more personalities than just yours. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about personalities from young human beings whose brains are not fully developed yet. So there's going to be moments, but that's okay. And I think that became a big part of my training and the things that I talked about. And so, yeah, those are the biggest influences, just those reassurances and making sure that we did a lot of scenarios, and me relating as much as I could to say, hey, look, this happened to me and I do this for a living. So it's okay. We're going to be there. We're going to talk about it. Everybody's going to be okay. As long as you're like, look, everybody gets to go home at the end of the day, we know we're good. That's the main thing.
10 fingers, 10 toes. Yep. And in good health. We all right. So speaking of challenges, what were some of the challenges that you may have faced with being a volunteer coordinator, but also being a volunteer and helping support everyone within the space?
They actually never came from the kids. As a volunteer, I don't think I had many things. Once I started, I don't think I had too many things that I considered challenges when it came to the kids. I love pretty much all those moments, even the moments that other people may consider really challenging in terms of behavior and things that happen. I loved them because they became teachable moments. They became moments that I can impart things and kind of use. I'm a very patient person, and I think that goes a very long way with children. And if you're patient, or you can force yourself to be in a lot of moments, you can see, like, you know what, not only can this be a moment that I can impart some wisdom, but this can be a relationship building moment, even when it comes to discipline. Because we talked a lot, I remember, and it's still a big talk, that kids love structure. They want someone to kind of put the rails on when they can. And so if you can be a person that can do that, in a very patient, wise way. There's not many challenges. My challenges as a volunteer came a lot from maybe the adults. I think anybody in OST will tell you that pretty much all your challenges come from adults, whether it's your people you work with or your upper management or parents. And so something that I consider a challenge, even though it wasn't a challenge for me, sort of in a way, it was sort of mentally challenging was, and you know this story well. That first year, once I'd had my two groups, I loved it so much and I wanted to kind of do something really special. And the Lion King on stage was in town. And, of course, that's a big deal. And I wanted to see it. I'd never seen it and heard a lot about it. So I came up with a permission slip and I sent that home. I think I even had it translated into Spanish and everything because I had some Hispanic kids and their parents, some of them didn't speak or read English. I had all my P's and Q's and everything was buttoned up. And I said, hey, because I think it was like a month and a half, maybe even 2 months out. And I said, hey, in there, I said, if you want to meet me and da 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 da, please come on. I'm here on Tuesdays and Thursdays at this time. Come anytime you want. I'd love to meet you and talk to you. Well, that never happened. Okay, all right. Well, it is what it is. So the day I think maybe I knew one parent of one child. And at the time, these were probably, let's see, I had two groups and there was probably maybe 8 children, something like that. Maybe a little bit more. I can't remember. So the day comes and I even rented a minivan so everybody could ride and I'm there and I'm standing in the parking lot of the school because that's where we were going to meet. And let me paint a picture for you. I'm 6'4". At the time I had dreadlocks in my hair and they had never seen me before in their lives. And these parents would drive up, drop their kid off and wave goodbye. And and I said, what? This was all of them. I think the one that I knew stopped and we had a conversation. Everybody else, whether they were English speakers or not, Black, white, Hispanic, they just dropped them off and said goodbye. I really was taken aback by that because I can tell you, we don't have kids yet, but when we do,
I want to know. I need your name. I need your birthday.
Yeah.
I need your social security number. Like, I don't know you.
Yeah. I mean, my first thing is like, look, if it was me and they said, hey, I'm here on these nights, I'm probably going more than one time to meet you. Like, not because I want to be that dude, but it's like, hey, you're in my child's life. You seem like to have a good time. They mentioned you at home. I want to come meet you before you take them off, supposedly, to this play or whatever. But nobody did. And nobody stopped to talk to me prior, except for one that I already had known. And that moment, that was a big moment too, in terms of, I know that mentally I incorporated that into my volunteer training and things as well, because it disturbed me. I like to feel comfortable as the adult. I want to meet parents. I wanted that relationship. And I think we kind of touched on participation earlier. Man, there's just, in a way, it's hard for me to articulate it completely, but I think a lot of you out there, especially if you're parents, you might get what I'm saying. It was just like, all of us, the child, the volunteer, the staff, everybody, society needs parents to be involved. We need parents to meet the people that are in our children's lives. I mean, nowadays may be rare for some of the parents to even meet teachers who are with your child every day. And these things are important. It's important for your child to know too, that like you know the people in their lives and you have relationships and you have reference points and you can talk about people and all these things. It's just like when you get married and you merge your lives. It's interesting when you think about how disconnected a parent can be from their child's life. You're almost not sharing your life with your own child sometimes. And I'm not a parent. I'm not preaching. I'm just saying I find it interesting that, because I know for me, I want to be right there. And as a volunteer, I wanted to be part of that life in a way. I wanted to be someone that those parents knew, like, hey, it's me.
Like, hey, sir.
Yeah.
Hey, Mr. Christopher. Because
absolutely,
that's what they call you.
Yeah, that's how we addressed Mr. Christopher. And so, that was a challenge. I know it sounds odd to call that a challenge, but it was for me. So there's that. Now, as a staff member, there's a lot of different challenges that I faced. One of them being, okay, so not only was I volunteering while a staff member, I was the volunteer coordinator. So I was the connection point between our volunteers and our staff and everything like that, and the kids, because I had to match volunteers to groups. So I had to kind of understand the groups as best I could and the volunteers as best I could. But I think, a lot of my challenges, just purely as staff, not necessarily from only the volunteer standpoint, was, onboarding. I think Catherine Spinney talked about onboarding in the first episode of the season, and like, you must onboard. Well, look, it's been over 10 years. So I'd say this, like, there was no onboarding in higher achievement at that time. we, you just came in.
We're gonna let the cat out the bag.
I mean,
We're gonna
look,
put it all on the table. Like, look,
I'm sure it's different now.
Struggle. Look.
And one of the reasons I know it's different is because myself and one of your other guests from last season, Marcos Martinez,
Marcos!
yes, who I consider to be my best friend, great guy. We both were kind of perturbed by the fact that, there were some real issues that everyone faced as a result of not having this onboarding, and I mean significant ones that we won't get into. Right. But so we kind of made it a mission to find ways to make that happen. And I think later, after we both were gone, it became not kind of official, or, it kind of became a real thing that happened, because for years, it may have been 4 or 5 years or something, there wasn't anything really officially official. So as a staff member, sort of almost in the same way I talked about being a volunteer and not feeling prepared, you kind of having to build the airplane as you fly, and that's not fun for anyone.
We're gonna make it.
Yeah. I think, Catherine did a good job of talking about that, so I won't rehash that. And since that's her thing every day, pretty much, she definitely had much more articulate and well-spoken words. That's kind of the same thing, articulate and well-spoken. But see what I'm talking about? To give. But the other thing, the initiatives, Pete Glassman, another of your guests from last season, I had the privilege of working with, he called it initiative fatigue. At the time, everything is always changing, and you're dealing with kids, you're dealing with volunteers, you're dealing with staff, but then it can be a real problem in any field when from up top, now I need you to institute this while you're doing all the other stuff you're doing. And oh, wait, you know what? So a couple months later, maybe we do this, and maybe we change that around. And you never have a chance, just like your head is spinning, you never have a chance to really feel out if the stuff you're already doing is working, and you're just trying to make it happen, period. Even without the other stuff, it's challenging. So that was one of the things. Now, in regard to actually the volunteer piece, when I was volunteer coordinator and the recruiting was challenging, there's various reasons for that. One of the things, like I said, one of my focuses became recruiting men. Again, so going back to no onboarding and no necessarily best practices existing.
Right.
Figuring out,
we're going to figure this out as we go.
Right. So then, okay, where do I go to recruit? I remember going to college events and stuff like that, which is great. We had some great U of R college students, and I think we had, what did we have, UVA? Or,
VCU actually, came on board after a while.
And we even
we started to reach over to J. Sargent Reynolds and those organizations.
I think we even
especially
had
those that were thinking about, and especially for those that were thinking about fields of education or, program development, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we had great college, and so we would go to these tabling events and things like that. But other than that, it was a struggle because partly, I guess, because it had never been done, but there wasn't a lot of information available. And it wasn't just higher achievements, fault, so to speak. But, again, at the time, I think Virginia, well, it's now called Mentor VA, but it was called Virginia Mentoring Partnership at the time. And they were still getting some things together. Great organization, by the way, Mentor VA. And I was actually stationed with them and worked for higher achievement. So that's a whole other thing. But so the recruiting piece was challenging because we needed to fill these slots. We needed people, period. So I couldn't even focus on men because I just needed people. I needed bodies to come in and work with these children. So that was a challenge. The other one that you and I talked about that was humorous in a way, but honestly, it's a real thing, was attire. Going back to the fact that we had a lot of college students, their style of dress may have been a little different from somebody who came from, the bank. At their office in the bank. So sometimes you have them come in the yoga pants or maybe it seemed like they might be going to a club later. I don't know. Those were some really interesting conversations. And I remember one young lady dressed particularly provocatively. Not, I guess we'll put it this way. I think other people will consider it that way. And that was my first one of, oh, and it's my job. Oh, okay, I have to talk to, and
You
it
gotta take
was,
my clothes.
I mean, nobody told me to do it, but I knew like it was concern for me. So
Mhm.
I talked to my supervisors like, yeah, I know it's my thing. You got any tips? Because there was a young lady and I'm a dude.
Right.
So
Mhm.
you know, I never want to foist off any job responsibilities, like because it's my job, so I can't say, well, oh, it's
Mhm.
a woman, so I don't feel comfortable. Like, no, we got to have this. And so the great thing is, and this actually ties into building relationships, not just with the children, but the volunteers and having good rapport because, I was fortunate in that she had a lot of respect for me. And so she kind of knew where I was going because she was
Mhm.
awesome. That's the thing, that she was a fantastic mentor. So it even made it more like, oh, I got to be real careful with this because I don't want her to be put off because
Right.
she was absolutely wonderful. And she's a great person. It's just that she was young and she dressed a certain way sometimes. And
Mhm.
so, luckily we had a good rapport and I
Mhm.
almost kind of got bailed out because she had respect for me. But, I realized like, okay, this is something too that became incorporated into my trainings too. It had not been put in before by anybody. And I kind of thought, and that's kind of where one of my goals in my life and career is whatever I learn, I'm going to leave that for somebody else. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm fortunate. I mean, I feel, and I say fortunate because a lot of that training is still used and at higher achievement today. As a matter of fact, I don't think we've ever mentioned the fact that Janice, Jay Lee, you
Uh-huh. Too
you,
late. They already know who I
I
am.
know.
Just drop
I'm
them
trying
off.
to keep it official. We actually ended up having the same job. I had the job manager of instruction, which was a
Yeah.
lot of volunteer management at Bouchard. And then later, I think it was like a couple of years later, maybe or a year later. No, it
Yeah.
was maybe 3 years because you had the same exact job at the same exact place.
Yeah.
And
At the same
so,
exact place.
yeah. And so when you were putting together the training, I was like, oh, that's that's like
Right.
my thing. And they
Yeah,
modified
that's
it.
my whole joint right there. I was like,
Yeah.
yes, it is
Yeah.
still being used and recycled.
Yeah.
Great job.
Yeah, and that's why I say I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate because I got to see like, oh, okay, so the lessons I learned and the things that I wanted to give to people are still being done.
Right.
So,
It's stuck, y'all. It's stuck.
yeah, I don't take pride or credit, let's say, in that term, like, it's just more, I feel great that it actually applied. So
Right.
those are the sort of challenges that I faced, but it was a great time. And anything that I call a challenge is all learning experiences. So that's how I take it.
Aw. And to kind of just add on to what you said, clothing is very important. It's not often, I'm not expecting you as a manager or a volunteer manager to come in with a three-piece suit, dressed down to the nines to mentor children. But I have a certain level of expectation that you come dressed appropriately for the occasion because you still have to remember, like, you are around children. You're not only around children, you're around young boys and you're also around young girls.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to be just like in the things that you say out of your mouth, the way you carry yourself, the way you dress is important because what do you want to project? Because kids are watching everything. They're here,
Hmm.
they're listening to everything, they're looking at everything. Whether they are aware that they're taking it in a certain way, they're looking for what's appropriate and what's not. What's an appropriate response to something? What's an
Hmm.
appropriate style of dress in a certain setting? What's an appropriate way to interact with other people? And so those things are very important to keep in mind when you're going to be around them.
All right, my next question for you is based on your experience and what you've known in this long career of after school programming, what are some of the changes that you see happening in the after school setting, based on volunteerism?
I think actually a lot of the changes that are going to or have been taking place in regard to volunteerism are kind of taking place across the board. And I think some of those have kind of been addressed here and there on the show. I think there's a diversity of delivery, of program delivery. I know that higher achievement, I don't know if it's still happening now, but they went ahead and went virtual. I think even in terms of volunteering, I know for me, I mentioned Partnership of the Future. I had just started there a couple of months before the pandemic started, and We had taken all of our programming virtual over the last year, even my meetings that I would have as part of my job as relationship manager. The other thing we took virtual was our Guides mentoring program, and that's a program where high school seniors are matched with a mentor to help them work through the college application and financial aid process. And in my role as relationship manager, I didn't get to interact as frequently with the students like I used to. And so I missed that, and so I signed up. I got a great mentee who was actually on this show as part of one of your teen talks, and her name is Sam. To this day, we've actually never met in person, but we had a really good time, some great conversations, and it worked out very well. Actually, I think the personal connection actually was just as valuable, I think, to both of us as the financial aid and application process. So we would use video platforms like Zoom, and we'd meet each other for a total of about a couple of hours a month. And it was wonderful. And luckily, we were able to build a good rapport that way and got it done. Now, I'm not saying that I think things will stay this way. In fact, I know many programs have already shifted away from virtual programming and mentoring and gone back to the in-person stuff, of course, with protocols and whatnot in place. But I think what happened has opened up a lot of options.
Yeah.
I think that's a great thing, especially in terms of volunteer work that allows virtual interaction. Many programs and organizations, nonprofit and otherwise, that employ volunteers aren't lucky enough to have the ability to do virtual volunteering, and so their volunteering has fallen off. And also, there's been, depending on the program, maybe brand new or renewed focus on family and their inclusion. And by that, I mean, when you look back at even this show, when Michael Wirtz from Henrico Education Foundation was on, he talked about how they reallocated funds to help Henrico families with food, supplies, and other necessities. And I think one of your guests from the Boys and Girls Club in your first episode spoke about doing virtual calls with families and showing how to prepare recipes and things like that. And that's awesome stuff. Some programs may have already had functionality like that and inclusion like that, but in many, many cases, it's not renewed, it's brand new. And now the majority, I think, of these programs, after school and otherwise, that deal with children and families are migrating to a holistic model more than they ever did. With so many families struggling, I think they want more support wherever they can get it too. And they're supporting the programs, and they're understanding that, hey, this is actually a community. This program or programs that my child is in are part of my life and their life. And many of us in the field have always thought of it this way. But I think sometimes out of necessity, these last almost 2 years, we've all kind of had to support each other, whether some parents couldn't work from home, meaning they had to think about childcare, or maybe somebody in a family was suffering with COVID, or maybe they didn't have food, because a lot of kids were getting most of their meals during the week from school. So then where are so many of those meals coming from? If they were lucky enough to even be able to go to school virtually, they're still missing meals, potentially. So it's become a thing where families and programs and school staff have really started to understand that more than they ever have. And even businesses that are not associated with education have said, oh, wow, our community really needs these things. And I think that's been a big push. So I can't say anything specific is going to happen in terms of trends across the board, but I'd say those general things have happened, and I'm very glad for them. It's a shame that it took this situation to do it. But necessity is the mother of invention, and the community has gotten creative about all of this stuff. And this has shaken most of us in the country, in the world, away from business as usual and doing things in the way they've always been done. I'm a big fan of it takes a village to raise a child. And so we've had the whole community getting to know each other and understand each other's needs in a way that hasn't happened before. Maybe a lot of this will stick and we can stay a village.
Thank you, Chris, for this conversation. It has been very, very helpful, especially when it comes around volunteering and some of the things that we should consider in those roles. But now it's time for our Professionals Lounge. Professionals Lounge is a segment of the show that allows guests to share advice and tips with other practitioners in the OST and youth development field about how they can begin growing their gifts and talents, but also developing themselves as professionals in the field. Today on Professionals Lounge, I asked Chris, what are some necessary conversations to have with incoming volunteers, and what should volunteers look for in a program that they want to volunteer with? Here's what he had to say.
Good questions. I think they both tie together very well, actually. Mission, culture, and protocols. Just about everything falls into those three buckets. Whether we're talking about these conversations during recruiting or training, they are necessary. A volunteer is giving you their time because they believe in your mission. Talk about that with them. Give them history, of course, but talk about the evolution of the organization, its outcomes, where it's headed, etc. Make them feel an essential part of that, because they are. There is so much information out there about the impact that volunteers have on their organizations in regard to how the time they give translates to dollar value and how the amount you invest in your volunteers translates to a return on investment. It's pretty amazing stuff. And I'll talk about that in a second and where to get some information on that. Culture is next. An organization must cultivate and maintain an internal culture of effectiveness, transparency, honesty, warmth, and collaboration. Talk to your volunteers about what the culture at your organization is like, how they can contribute to that as well, but also how it translates to the work that they're doing when they give their time. Especially if your volunteers interact with the public. You want them to exude their enjoyment to the public. You can't teach that. You can only make it possible by living it every day as an organization, and that's going to translate to more volunteers, more donors, and supporters. And hey, bonus, it doesn't cost a thing to create and maintain a good culture. Well, maybe a little time investment, but hey, willingness to invest that time is part of great culture too. It's all upside. Finally, protocols. Whatever the work environment and duties of your volunteers, they need to understand protocols. Whether they work in a school, at tabling events, in your office, or at home, they need to know chain of command, who to take issues and questions to, and how all the processes that they may need will work. Those processes can refer to the work they're doing, bad experiences with a member of the public, personal issues with a staff member, things like that. Give them security and confidence that they will be taken care of. Give volunteers entree to ask any and all questions that they need. And always, at the first opportunity, have one-on-one conversations. Learn about each other personally and in conjunction to their connection to the organization's mission and their volunteer experience. That's going to pay off big time. There are some good resources that talk about all this stuff. One that I'm familiar with is the national program Service Enterprise Initiative, and they have some great information on this. If you go to pointsoflight.org, and that is Points of Light, all one word, .org, for information on that and a lot more in regard to volunteers. Now, when it comes to what a volunteer should look for, we go back to the 3 buckets I mentioned, starting with mission. A lot of organizations out there do work for the same causes, but they may focus on different aspects of that cause. And even if not, they may execute their program differently and use volunteers in different ways. Before you sign up, ask a lot of questions to make sure that you're about to invest your time in an organization that aligns with your values and will use you in a way that you will enjoy and or be fulfilled by, hopefully both. Then we go to culture. Does the organization execute its hour-by-hour, day-to-day activities in a way that's effective, efficient, rewarding, and fun? Even if mission and execution align with what you're looking for, does the culture? Again, I point back to the episode of this podcast that covers culture with Marcos Martinez. Last, protocols. Do you feel safe and secure in understanding how your role works in the greater scheme? Do you know who to go to for what? Do you know how the grievance process works in the event that you may need it? Ask questions, ask some more questions, and if you need to, ask more than that. If you plan to give your time to an organization, you should know everything you need to in order to feel confident that it is being put to good use. Last note for organizations and volunteers, volunteer job descriptions help a lot. Just like if you're hiring an employee, you need a job description. This person is going to be spending time in your staff, using your resources and such. So do the same for volunteers. Volunteers having some understanding of duties and overall workflow ahead of time is awesome. That helps with mission, culture, and protocol.
Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of our show. I'd like to thank Chris for being our guest today. This was an amazing conversation, and I'm so happy that you could share your insights with us based on your experiences as a volunteer, but also as a volunteer manager. Can't wait to have you back on the show, babe. If you enjoyed the episode and feel you received some good information, give us a review on Apple Podcasts or visit the Podchasers website and leave us a comment. This will help us get some feedback on the show and collect testimonials for our personal website. Share us with your friends, share us with your family, share us with your network. Help us spread the word about how OSC programs are impacting our youth and our communities. We can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Podcast Addict. Well, that's all I have for today. In the words of Mr. Arthur Ashe, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Until next time, bye-bye.